It's always a pleasure to talk to my next guest. In fact, one of my other guests on this week's show said, I like it when you talk to Nathan J. Robinson. It gives me hope for the future. I thought, well, as a matter of fact, I'm about to talk to Nathan J. Robinson again. He is a prolific writer. He is the editor and publisher of Current Affairs magazine, which I enjoy a great deal and recommend to you without reservation. He is also a media mogul in the making with his efforts to expand into podcasts and now video. So first of all, Nathan J. Robinson, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you, RJ. It's always nice to be here with you.
Well, it's always great to talk to you, and congratulations on becoming such a polymath. I'm still working on becoming a monomath. I don't even think I'm even there yet. But you've been putting out a lot of great stuff lately, and I've really been enjoying it. So I thought we could just maybe talk about some of the things that have been striking you or that you've been writing about. But and then maybe from there we can figure out what the zeitgeist is right now.
The zeitgeist.
Yeah, or is there no longer a zeitgeist? It was the zeitgeist an affectation from another era that never really existed, or has it dissolved or whatever? But let's just start with, sometimes, I've said this to you before, Nathan, but sometimes I feel like you're reading my mind and I make these little notes. I think I'll write about this, but I don't get around to it. And then I see that that Nathan J. Robinson has written about it. For example, not only did you write about the recent incident in which an animal rights activist interrupted Kamala Harris as she was giving a speech to make his pitch about animal rights, but you even you fixated on the dimension of that I think one of the dimensions of it I think was critical, which is the animal rights or the animal welfare movement, a movement with which I am actually basically very sympathetic, doesn't know much about how not to have an awful public image. And in this case, I have a white man, and as you point out, and you could have wrested the words from my own brain, one with a man bun, no less, interrupts a black woman prioritizing his issues over hers when she was talking about the gender wage gap. It's like and the message, join the animal rights movement, which I didn't pick up on his shirt. It's not really an invitation. I believe that many people were driven to take him up on at that moment.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many new recruits the animal rights movement got. The optics, as they say, of that were terrible, right? Because every part of it, right? The fact that he's a white man with a man bun and she's a black woman talking to another black woman. The fact that they're talking about the gender wage gap. He didn't even get to say anything about animal rights. It was a serious miscalculation, I think, as to how these things look and how you advance your cause. But it's something that. I'm a very strong supporter of animal. In fact, I think that, I wrote an article fairly recently called Animals in 2020 about how the various presidential candidates, none of them have paid any attention to things like factory farming that I think are very, very morally serious issues. The suffering and torture and death of animals on an industrial scale is a real scandal of 21st century civilized society. And so I respect completely the animal rights and there's sort of a distinction between animal rights and animal welfare sometimes, but I use the terms interchangeably. But animal welfare activists who try and get this issue more attention, because it's true that they are quite desperate, right? Because these candidates are not going to discuss the plight of non-human animals unless drastic measures are taken. So I think, I'm sympathetic because some of it comes from desperation, right? None of the 2020 candidates are going to talk about this at their forums. And I'm not opposed in principle to the tactic of storming the stage and taking the microphone from a politician. But also, you have to be really, really strategic. You've got to think, what advances the animal rights cause and what doesn't. And for a long time, I think there have been many tactical errors by animal rights activists, and especially, the embarrassing stunts pulled by PETA, that have really set back the movement and made it more fringe than it needs to be.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, and I feel strongly about animal welfare slash animal rights, and I was actually vegan at one point, although I eat meat now. But I also recognize in eating meat that I exist in in a morally compromised state. I mean, that's the way I feel about it, and I also feel that. Enormous compassion, identification with animals. We've covered the Non-Human Rights Project on this show, which is, a fascinating to me. If you haven't written about it in current affairs, you might want to consider that.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're doing wonderful work on getting primates who are being mistreated in cages to be given something closer to human status in the courts so that they can get better treatment for them and so on. So I'm close to this issue. I care about this issue. I feel that it's the next great frontier in our awareness of injustice, which I think is part of human progress to broaden our awareness of injustice. So I have deep and strong feelings of affinity and support for the animal rights and animal welfare movement, at the same time that I think it is filled with the kinds of missteps that you describe that make it hard for me to even have conversations like this with people, because even very left-wing people all of a sudden, oh, you mean those guys who, you mean like the man bun dude, basically. You get that response. Or the people who you point out, PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, wanting to call fish sea kittens or whatever.
Oh, the list of stuff they've done is just, they went after like a memorial for Steve Irwin, saying that, Steve Irwin died harassing a stingray. They've gone after like seeing eye dog programs. They picketed the Westminster Dog Show dressed as the Klan. They declared, they had a thing where they were against catching Pokemon because they said it was like the zoo. It's like all of the stuff that is the worst caricature you could imagine of an animal rights activist is the things that they've actually done, to the point where it almost seems like they're a false flag operator. Like the meat industry couldn't ask for better opposition than PETA, who are like telling Hamburg, New York, that they should change their name to Veggieburg. Or they also spread kind of conspiracy theories like milk causes autism and things like that. It's just makes it very difficult because they're the largest and most prominent animal rights organization in the country.
And then the most famous at one point antagonist for the meat industry was Morrissey of the Smiths of Meat is Murder fame, who's turned out to be this blatant, seems to me, racist and embarrassment. So there's really not anybody as a spokesman for animal welfare or no organization that seems to be carrying the message well. Can you envision what that might look like? What an what a smart, effective animal welfare movement might look like in practice?
Well, the first thing is it would consider everything in terms of its likely effect. I know people who I think are effective and useful and good animal rights activists, and Glenn Greenwald, who we interviewed about this for Current Affairs, has been doing a lot of journalism on what happens to pigs in factory farms and has been a big champion of the cause. And his approach is, well, you lay out powerful arguments to people and you show people the facts, you show people the lives of animals, you show people the reality of what's happening. And so I respect a lot of the animal liberation activists who do things like, I'm not saying that you can't be radical or disruptive. So when they go and they free animals from factory farms and slaughterhouses, and they expose the conditions inside, and they take on the animal agriculture industry by showing people the pictures that the industry doesn't want shown. In fact, the group that was behind the disruption of Kamala Harris was doing an action at the same time where they were going to a slaughterhouse for ducks, and they were rescuing sick ducks and showing that the really debilitated condition of these poor ducks who were waiting to be killed. And I think that sort of thing, where you're really showing the costs in the suffering of sentient creatures, that is powerful and that speaks to people. I mean, the polling shows that people are very sympathetic to many of the arguments that activists for animals are making, right? The public doesn't want animals to be tortured. The public is open to, many, many, many more restrictions on what you can do, and making sure that so long as we are still going to have killing, and so long as people are still going to eat meat, it is at least done according to very, very strict standards. And I think, so it's just a matter of like, well, how do you make the arguments powerfully? How do you expose the facts powerfully, rather than how do you get the most attention? And I think that needs to be a shift, because PETA's approach has generally been, how do we generate the most publicity? And they do generate a lot of publicity, but I don't think that publicity actually changes minds. So it's a shift in mindset from how do we get attention to how do we change minds.
Right, and I think that's very well said. And in fact, some publicity may change minds in the way you don't want them to be changed.
Oh, yeah.
So that's something to be concerned about. And I was thinking also, and again, we're talking with Nathan J. Robinson, writer and editor/publisher of Current Affairs magazine. I was also thinking, as you were talking, that it would be interesting, instead of, for example, this white guy with a man bun antagonizing and physically getting in the space of a black woman, which, by the way, women are subject to violence in our society. So the very act of invading a woman's space physically by a man, to me, is deeply offensive in this context. Instead of doing something like that, it would be interesting, for example, I broadcast this program from a part of Washington, D.C. that is predominantly black, predominantly lower income, and like many such urban areas, is a food desert. So I was thinking while you were talking, wouldn't it be interesting if the animal rights movement, people who live here and don't have a car or whatever, it would be very hard to go vegetarian in this area, given the paucity of food purchasing opportunities available. There's no supermarket, for example, with a mouse. So wouldn't it be interesting if there were a way to link the animal welfare movement and the movement for more affordable and better food access in our urban areas? Just a thought.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think one of the crucial things that needs to be done is linking the struggle for increased animal welfare to other social justice causes, and not having it be its own thing set up where people who are animal activists are just animal activists and they're not part of the broader left. And I think that's one of the reasons that people on the left are often suspicious of the movement, is because the cliche or the unfair kind of stereotype is, well, you care more about what happens to chickens than what happens to human beings. And I think the way to respond to that is to say, I care about both, and I'm part of the efforts to improve the lives of both, and to sort of connect multiple, as you say, multiple struggles for justice as part of the same thing, work with other groups, and not make it feel like there's a trade-off where you're either an animal rights activist or you are a sort of a left political activist who cares about people.
There's another dimension of this too, Nathan J. Robinson, that I think is important to remember in the context of animal welfare. I was part of a whole discussion at one point. I was much more involved in the discussion of the ethical use of technology, which overlaps with things like transhumanism and artificial intelligence and all these areas. And at one point, and this might have been about 13, 14 years ago, a video went out. A defense contractor had created something like a robot dog. It looked very much like a dog. Clearly, it's not alive. It's just a mechanical device, but it had 4 legs and could carry a pack. And there was video showing how resilient the robot dog was as a military tool. So, and to show how resilient it was, they show somebody kicking it really hard. And it just goes flying. And then, but we're supposed to be impressed because it gets right up on its 4 legs and keeps going. And there was a lot of discussion about this video, and people were saying, well, it's silly to be upset about the video because it's just a machine. And I said, no, I don't think it is, because I think the upset is not about the machine. It's about us, and whether the sort of imitation of life that the machine represents is another tool to strip us of our empathy. And in the case of
Mm.
animals, they are alive, they are sentient, they have many of the qualities we treasure in ourselves, and increasing scientific awareness that they have a sense of self-consciousness, they have a sense of their own existence in the universe in some way, mirror tests and so on. So adding to the sort of robot dog analogy, the fact that these are actual living things, and that if we can if we can cultivate, I hate to use that sort of new agey terminology, but if we can cultivate our compassion towards these other living things, I would argue to my fellow leftists, it will make us better leftists in human matters as well.
Yeah, I think you're right actually, because it's funny thinking about that robot dog. I'm imagining, well, how would people react if the military was testing a robot baby and they had the video of people drowning and kicking the robot baby? I think they'd be disturbed. I think people understand why drowning the robot baby would be disturbing, but the robot dog, because it's just a dog. There is something about that where it is partially because we don't empathize with animals in the way that we do with our fellow human beings. And creating that empathy is really the crucial first step. And it's very hard because people don't empathize with their fellow human beings if they're slightly different from themselves. So, lesser forms of life. But then, as a lot of people have pointed out, it's also true that we all have a kind of inconsistency where everyone empathizes with their animals, with their pets, with anyone who saw someone kicking a kitten on the street would be disturbed and might step in. And it's just this bizarre inconsistency where animals that are just as much or more emotionally sophisticated, like pigs, because they're pigs, because we see them as meat and we don't see them as friends, do not receive the same level of sympathetic concern. And so pointing out that inconsistency to people and making them uncomfortable with it and not letting them kind of avoid it is, I think, critical.
I think I agree. And again, we are talking with Nathan J. Robinson, writer and publisher of and publisher of Current Affairs. And as long as we're talking about empathy and the limits thereof, I believe we have talked about him before, but I cannot resist, Nathan, using that as a segue to the public intellectual that you described in a recent headline as the world's most, I'm chuckling a little bit, annoying man. And we are speaking of Steven Pinker. Now, Steven Pinker is a linguist. He is a psychologist. I guess he's a psychologist. He talks about language. He's a Harvard psychologist. He is wonderfully popular in all sorts of educated circles. He is sort of an intellectual about town in that regard. People love to read him and quote him, or at least display his books prominently on their bookshelves, whether they read them or not. And I have had troubles with Steven Pinker for a long time. You have had trouble with Steven Pinker, and you recently reviewed Pinker's approach and his book Enlightenment Now, which, quote, was Bill Gates's most new favorite book of all time, according to someone somewhere. What is wrong with Steven Pinker and the public adoration of Steven Pinker?
Well, he's had these two big books. He had the first, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and second, Enlightenment Now. And both of them kind of, they endorse this thesis about history, which is to say, he's very concerned to say, well, people who think the world's going to hell in a handbasket, they're all wrong. And they don't understand the facts, they don't understand the data, they haven't looked and seen how violence has declined over time, how life expectancy has gone up, how disease and famine and poverty have gone down, and actually we're making a lot of progress, so we all need to calm down, stop freaking out, and just embrace science and reason, and we will have a glorious future ahead of us. And what's so annoying about him to me, what really frustrates me about his whole approach, is he has a very sort of patronizing dismissal of people on the left, especially, where he says, oh, people on the left who are all talking about all the problems we face, they don't appreciate all of the gains we've made. And what annoys me about that is that, first off, it's not true. We all know that progress has been made. We all know that it's better to live now than in 1500, or, for the average person. We all know that we're glad we didn't die in childbirth. But he also doesn't really understand what it has taken to make a lot of this progress. So he's very contemptuous of activists and he uses the phrase social justice warriors. But we only have more social justice because there have been social justice warriors for hundreds of years fighting really, really hard in order to make the gains that he's so proud of. And he kind of attributes it to the benevolent. He says at one point, the benevolent forces of modernity, the institutions of democracy and capitalism, as if those things, work their magic on their own, as if they do so without human beings putting in labor and sacrifice and struggle. We don't have an 8-hour workday because of the benevolent forces of modernity. We have it because people were in unions and people weren't satisfied with what they had, and people were willing to demand more. And so he's kind of asking us to be more satisfied when actually the dissatisfaction is what leads us, and the feeling that we haven't accomplished what we should have accomplished and we demand more because we know that society is capable of more. That's the impetus for progress. And that's why I'm so annoyed when people like him are kind of complacent about progress and don't really see what it's going to take in order to have more of it.
See, well, a couple thoughts on that, and I think it's extremely well said, Nathan, but one is that modernity without a sense of social justice leads to efficiency over humanity, which leads in its ultimate form, I'll be provocative here, to concentration camps, to Arbeit macht frei, to work makes you free, to, without the leavening, I would argue that it's social justice, that is, and I think you're arguing, that has made modernity humane. Here's one of the things that really, to the extent that it is, and in many ways, of course, it is not, but here's one of the things that, what annoys me about Steven Pinker is what annoys me about the New Atheists, which is, and I know you briefly mentioned Sam Harris and his lack of ability in moral reasoning, but I think that what Hitchens, Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Steven Pinker have in common is that I believe that all of their viewpoints are rooted in gut, emotional, visceral dislikes, to which they then construct an elaborate intellectual superstructure, and they put enough effort into the superstructure that people who aren't willing to really investigate just say, oh, well, they must know what they're talking about, and therefore they become the voices of reason, rationality. But I believe that, for example, that Christopher Hitchens had an aesthetic revulsion to the notion of God. Many of us find religious writings that contain much beauty and insight. He doesn't see that. He sees them as irritating and annoying and creates an intellectual structure around it. I think Harris, something similar, Dawkins, something similar. And I think Steven Pinker is that way with social justice and progressives. I think it annoys him, and I think he then creates an intellectual superstructure that tries to turn that annoyance into rational analysis, but it's still just the bias of one person.
Yeah, I think, well, that's definitely true with Pinker, because I go through his books and I point out that he isn't committed to facts and reason. His book is about the commitment to data and rigorous thinking. But if you caricature the people who disagree with you, then that's not what you're doing, right? You're not engaging in the thing that you're saying everyone should engage in. And you're right about Hitchens, because Hitchens sort of was not a very rigorous thinker. In fact, when he went up against really intellectually serious Christians, he didn't do all that well. There's a debate with him and William Lane Craig, who's a very sort of analytical Christian thinker who really kind of cleans his clock, because I think Hitchens said at one point, I think he has, I might be wrong, I think he has some quote where he says, he's more kind of disgusted by the idea of God, or he hates it than kind of like just believing that this is where the arguments lead. And I think it's absolutely true. And I think one of the dangerous things is when you don't recognize. But I mean, many of us are like that. I mean, I am under no illusion that many of my beliefs come from kind of instinctual revulsion of things and are very hard to justify rationally. I think reason is the slave of the passions a lot of the time. But what's dangerous is when you don't notice that tendency in yourself, when you really think that what you're doing, what everyone else is doing, is just emotion driven, and what you're doing is fact driven. You care about the data and they don't care about the data. And maybe it's true, sometimes it's true, but also once you become convinced that that's the person you are, you develop these real serious, arrogant blind spots, and you don't notice. I mean, Sam Harris has some really scary stuff where he talks about like how courts, hopefully we can get to a point where like courts are just examining people's brains to determine whether they're telling the truth. And he has these really, we wrote an article about him where he has these really Orwellian, dystopian passages in his work. And he gets to those dystopias through what he thinks is a process of just pure reason. He's like, well, reason takes me to this point where I envisage this kind of society. And I think the lesson of the horrors of the 20th century should not be, that socialism or utopianism is bad, but that when you're so convinced of your own rightness that you're willing to impose it without thinking about why other people object to you, that's when the real horror is unleashed.
Well, I think that's right. And I also think that's when the banal horrors are unleashed too, because I think that the technocratic impulse, for example, in centrist politicians is a milquetoast version of the same thing. It may not lead to the horrifying totalitarian dystopia, but it leads to a world where you genuinely believe that your own biases are objective reality. We saw this in the healthcare debate, for example, where people create these Rube Goldberg-like schemes to try to avoid just having the government give everyone adequate health care, and yet they think, no, I'm the rational one and you're not. Well, they're not. And in terms of Sam Harris, for example, yes, he may think he's being rational, but I've had run-ins with Sam. He hates Muslims. He just hates them. He hates everything about them. And even though he says he hates all religions, he does not, for example, talk about nuking Tel Aviv or Haifa, but he talks about nuking Muslim capitals, dropping nuclear weapons on them in order to eliminate, the cancer of religion. And yet he says, no, this is just where rationality has led me. It's with all of these people, and I think Pinker's a perfect example. But I tend to think Harris, as well as Hitchens and Dawkins, that really it's no different than arguing with that uncle at a holiday dinner who said, no, I'm just being rational and you're being, whatever, a weird kid.
Or an emotional snowflake, as they call the young people today, as snowflakes.
Yeah, I got hippie, but yeah, its principle is the same. And look, I think that the fact is, I like what you say better, which is let's acknowledge that, we're not all, shouldn't be we're not computers, right? I mean, we have emotions, we have spiritual dimensions, souls, whatever you want to call them, whether you believe in the theology of soul. We have a supra-rational aspect that is precious to me and beautiful and worthy of to be honored and cherished and acknowledged. And there are some questions that can't be answered, in my view, with rationality. But when someone cloaks themselves and say, this is all right, I'm repelled by the abuse of animals. I'm repelled by the mistreatment of my fellow human beings. I'm repelled when a human being is not allowed to live out and fulfill its greatest potential. But I know that that's not a rational decision, and I don't claim it is. So I guess I'm arguing for the irrational in politics. I don't know if that's a vulnerable position to take, but damn it, it's the one I'm taking.
Well, we could also call it moral instinct, and I think all of us have moral instincts, and they're not necessarily irrational. We just don't quite know where they come from, and we are helpless in the face of them. And I think that's okay. I think as long as we examine those things and we try to apply rationality to the degree possible, and we're self-critical, we're never going to achieve it perfectly, but we can be sort of more and less reasonable people. And just like humility is a good thing, and we should all display a bit of it. And that's what I don't like about these guys, is they don't understand that like humility is the root of the real use of reason. Right? That's when real scientists, real philosophers doubt. Doubt is the beginning of knowledge. Doubting yourself, doubting everything, and they have such confidence and such arrogance, and you think, well, that is the opposite of what real thinking usually displays.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And Nathan, we're running out of time, and there was so much I wanted to talk to you about. I kind of love the DSA too. You wrote a piece why I love the DSA. I love the fact that I love the solidarity. I love the fact that they're very interested in, and Maria Svart, the director, has been on talking about this, very interested in winning and exercising power, but at the same time, an ideal. We're not going to get a chance to talk about that. And I'm really, I would have also loved to talk to you. I, like you, have been stranded for long periods of time at Heathrow Airport's terminal number 5, where I believe that the lack of electric outlets is a metaphor for the modern situation. There's power out there, but I can't get near it, no matter where I sit.
That's funny.
There's always someone there before me that I deeply identified.
Well, next time.
All right. Well, as always, it is a pleasure to talk to you. And before we go, anything you want to tell our viewers/listeners about current affairs, what you guys are up to?
Well, they need to go to currentaffairs.org and, of course, subscribe to our magazine if they haven't, and our podcast's Patreon. And then we have lots of exciting stuff coming up. We have lots of new interviews on the podcast, and we're also going to be doing a series of YouTube videos where we explain basic lefty concepts and rebut terrible right-wing arguments. And we're going to be doing a fundraiser for that soon, and we're very excited.
Well, I look forward to hearing more about it. And I will not call you king of all media yet, because we're non-monarchical here, but as